My name is Zyzik and I'm a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and today I'll be talking about the role of input in first and second language acquisition. Input refers to all of the ambient language that the learner is exposed to. It's also known as the primary linguistic data or the positive evidence. So let's think about some examples of what could be input. Input can be written or spoken. So in terms of written input, it could be this novel that my students are reading in their class right now. It can be a news story that you read first thing in the morning to find out what's happening in the world. It could be something as simple as a food label that you read on a product to make sure it doesn't have anything you're allergic to. It could be a road sign or an advertisement on a billboard. Those are all examples of written input. In terms of spoken input, there are also many different kinds. It could be a lecture in a class that you're listening to. It can be a podcast that you like to listen to in your free time. It could be your favorite Netflix series that you watch and listen to. It could be something as simple as a voicemail that somebody left on your phone. So when we interact with input, we're always trying to get meaning from it. So input is a general term that is used to refer to all kinds of linguistic data available for the learner. Researchers oftentimes use the term exposure and input synonymously. It's important to note that exposure is something that we can observe, it's something that we can measure and then describe in a particular context, such as in the first language acquisition context. What we're interested in is child-directed speech. So the question comes up, how do we measure input? What are we really measuring and what are we looking for? Well, we can measure, for example, how many words a child is exposed to in an hour, or how many words a child is exposed to in an average day. Needless to say, when we're measuring input, it's much easier to do this when it's a controlled environment. So in first language acquisition, a young child is usually just interacting with one or maybe two primary caregivers. And so it becomes relatively easy to measure the input in that kind of a controlled setting. In a second language acquisition setting, this becomes a little bit more challenging because the learner may be interacting with all different sorts of people during the day and may be getting input from various sources. So some attempts to measure and control the input have been done in what are known as first exposure studies. So those are studies in which a group of learners is exposed for the first time to a language that is completely unknown to them. And the input is highly controlled, and everything is recorded, and everything is then analyzed. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about measuring and describing input is input quantity versus input quality, and both are important measures. So quantity is rather obvious, and it's usually determined in terms of number of words spoken to the child in a particular period of time, so in an hour or in a day. Input quality can be measured in different ways, it can be operationalized in different ways, but one common index of input quality is something known as lexical diversity. So that would be the number of different words spoken to the child in a certain time frame. When we're thinking about input in first language acquisition, what we know is that the typical child is exposed to a massive amount of input in the 4 or 5 years that they spend listening to their caregivers before they enter formal schooling. However, there are differences in input quantity among different families. So in other words, there are individual differences in various aspects of caregiver speech to children. And what's more is that these differences have been shown to correlate with all different measures of language growth in children. Another interesting fact that should be brought up is the fact that there are demographic factors that are related to caregiver speech. So we know from a number of research studies that parents with high socioeconomic status tend to speak more to their children. They tend to provide more input than parents or caregivers of lower socioeconomic status. Let's talk a little bit about input that a second language learner might get. So when we were talking about children, we should note that a child's primary source of input is spoken language for the first 4, 5, or 6 years of their life. In contrast, a second language learner, especially a classroom learner, is likely to be exposed to both spoken and written input from the very beginning of their experience. But let's talk about spoken input first. What kinds of spoken input can be found in a typical language classroom? Well, we like to think about this in terms of 4 types of spoken input. There's the spoken input from the teacher, so that would be teacher talk. There's the spoken input from the fellow classmates. There's spoken input that the learner produces. So in this sense, it's the learner's output that then becomes their own input. And then there's spoken input from a variety of audio and audiovisual sources that the teacher provides and prepares for listening tasks. One thing that we know is that input in a classroom setting in the second language acquisition context is not ideal in many ways. So although all of the sources of input that I've mentioned are important, they're obviously very limited in the sense that they represent a narrow range of spoken text that learners will encounter outside of the classroom. And generally speaking, what this means is that learners, second language learners, are often unprepared for dealing with unscripted spoken discourse outside of the classroom. So that's the spontaneous speech that they'll hear when they step out into the real world. So as I mentioned earlier, second language learners are also exposed to written input, usually from the very beginning of their classroom study of a language. And this is very important, especially when the writing script is the same. So for example, an English-speaking learner of Spanish or an English-speaking learner of French will be able to access written input right away, and they'll be able to learn from that input. This is going to be a key factor in the language acquisition process. In contrast, if the learner does not share the writing script, so for example, an English-speaking learner of Chinese or Japanese is going to have a delayed start, if you will, with accessing written input. So in a way, by accessing written input sooner, the learner should have an advantage because they'll be able to augment the amount of input that they get, and they'll be able to start learning from that input sooner. When we're talking about classroom second language acquisition contexts, we note that the input is very limited in terms of quantity because there are just a few hours of classroom time per week. It could be 3 hours per week, it could be 5 hours per week, but even under the best of circumstances, this is very minimal compared to the amount of input that children get in the first 5 years of their life, for example. That classroom input is also less than ideal from the point of view of input quality. So here we refer to the fact that teacher talk is often very different in terms of input from the kinds of speech that you would hear naturally in a more naturalistic setting. There's been research, for example, to show that teachers of Spanish tend to overuse subject pronouns in their teacher talk. So they'll use more subject pronouns than they would, for example, when they're talking with a native speaker friend. In this way, the input becomes distorted in terms of that particular grammatical property. The other thing that we've mentioned is that classroom input gives the learner little or no opportunity to hear unscripted speech, so that's spontaneous spoken discourse that they'll be exposed to in the real world. So the distinction between input and intake is an important one because while we can objectively measure and describe input, we can't do the same thing with intake. Intake is a learner internal process and we can't see it happening. There are many factors that determine what parts of the input become intake, such as perceptual salience, the learner's prior knowledge, whether the feature is redundant, and among many other factors. And one thing that's important to note is that many current second language teaching methods are concerned with making the input more salient. So in some way, they're trying to focus the learner's attention, or they're trying to draw the learner's attention to properties of the input so that certain parts of the input are then available for becoming intake.